Yes, it's just me. All right, exactly. Yeah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're going to bring out the Secretary General in just a second, who will deliver some remarks to introduce the latest report of the UN Global Crisis Response Group on food, energy, and finance. As I mentioned yesterday, he will not be able to take questions. Rebeca Grynspan, the Secretary General of UNCTAD, will be here. She will present the report and then take your questions. So.
And if we beg him for a question?
Sorry?
If we beg him for a question, would he try?
Very good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you very much for your presence. And let me begin by also thanking Rebeca Grynspan and the Global Crisis Response Group for this latest brief on how the war in Ukraine, in all its dimensions, is affecting people around the world. Today's report makes clear that the war's impact on food security, energy and finance is systemic, severe, and speeding up. It is amplifying the consequences of the many other crises the world faces: climate, COVID-19, and the severe global inequalities in the resources available for the recovery from the pandemic. 3 months into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we face a new reality. For those on the ground, every day brings new bloodshed and suffering. And for people around the world, the war, together with the other crises, is threatening to unleash an unprecedented wave of hunger and destitution, leaving social and economic chaos in its wake. Vulnerable people and vulnerable countries are already being hit hard, but make no mistake, no country or community will be left untouched by this cost of living crisis. Food prices are at near record highs. Fertilizer prices have more than doubled, sounding an alarm everywhere. Without fertilizers, shortages will spread from corn and wheat to all staple crops, including rice, with a devastating impact on billions of people in Asia and South America too. This year's food crisis is about lack of access. Next year's could be about lack of food. Record high energy prices are also triggering blackouts and fuel shortages in all parts of the world, especially in Africa. And the financial squeeze continues on many developing countries, on top of the risk of debt default and economic collapse because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the inequality of the recovery, and the climate crisis. Worldwide, 3 out of 5 workers are earning less than before the pandemic. Now, both countries and individuals have no hope of balancing their budgets. Instead, families everywhere are being forced into impossible decisions, whether to shut down their businesses, sell their livestock, or take their children out of school. Women and girls are often the last to eat and the first to miss meals as food shortages spread. And the number of severe food insecure people has doubled in the past 2 years. The World Food Programme estimates the ripple effects of the war could increase the number of people facing severe food insecurity by 47 million in 2022. Ladies and gentlemen, in reality, there is only one way to stop this gathering storm in its tracks. The Russian invasion of Ukraine must end, the deaths and destruction must stop, a political solution must be found in line with international law and the United Nations Charter. But until that happens, we need immediate action on 2 fronts. First, we need to bring stability to global food and energy markets to break the vicious cycle of rising prices and bring relief to developing countries. Ukraine's food production and the food and fertilizer produced by Russia must be brought back into world markets despite the war. I've asked Rebeca Grynspan and my humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, to coordinate 2 task forces to help find a package deal that allows for the safe and secure export of Ukrainian-produced foods through the Black Sea and unimpeded access to global markets for Russian food and fertilizers. This deal is essential for hundreds of millions of people in developing countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa. Rebecca and Martin have been working closely with all parties to move this forward, and in the past 10 days, they have held direct contacts with Moscow, Kyiv, Ankara, Brussels, and Washington. At this point, saying anything more in public would jeopardize the chances of success, and I ask for your understanding. This is one of the moments where silent diplomacy is necessary, and the welfare of millions of people around the world could depend on it. Second, we need to make resources available immediately to help the poorest countries and communities. Governments must be able to borrow the money they need to keep their economies afloat and their people thriving. And there is no solution to this global crisis without a solution to the economic crisis in the developing world. The global financial system must rise above its shortcomings and use all the instruments at its disposal with flexibility and understanding to provide support to vulnerable countries and vulnerable people. The message of today's report is clear and insistent. We must act now to save lives and livelihoods over the next months and years. It will take global action to fix this global crisis. We need to start today. Thank you. I now leave you with the competent hands of Rebeca Grynspan to present you the report and to be naturally at your disposal for any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rebecca, it's your show. Please.
Thank you, Stefan. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for the launch of the second brief of the Global Crisis Response Group. This is the document that we have made available to all of you. That is the second brief that we bring to your attention. The Secretary General has pointed to the main messages of the report and highlighted the suffering and destruction the war in Ukraine in all its dimensions is causing, which now extends far beyond its borders. Our main message in this second brief is this. We are on the brink of the most severe global cost of living crisis in a generation. The report demonstrates the interconnected nature of the three dimensions of the crisis: food, energy, and finance. And that tackling just one aspect will not solve the global crisis we are in. This is creating a cost of living vicious cycle, increasing the impact on families and countries. Incomes are being squeezed, and families are being forced to decide how to allocate shrinking household finances, perhaps choosing whether to skip a meal, keep children in school, buy less nutritious food, keep a family business open or closed, or pay medical bills. And so, with this in mind, another cycle, another vicious cycle starts. The cycle of social unrest, leading to political instability as a result of the weakened ability of countries and families to cope with yet another global crisis, on top of COVID-19 and the climate crisis. Our second message is this. The current food crisis may rapidly turn into a food catastrophe of global proportions in 2023. Higher energy costs and trade restrictions on the fertilizer supply from the Black Sea region have resulted in fertilizer prices rising even faster than food prices. If the war continues and grain and fertilizers high prices persist into the next planting season, the present crisis could extend, as the Secretary General just mentioned, to other basic foods, such as rice, that will affect, as we all know, billions more people. And finally, let me underline that this is a global crisis which nobody can escape. But finally, let me also emphasize that the vulnerable are already suffering the most. Just an example to understand how this impacts households. In the report, we show data that a 10% increase in food prices will represent a 5% decrease in incomes of the poorest families. But what does it mean, a 5% decrease in families' income? 5% is all what the poorest families spend on health. So let's take that into account. It's not a minor thing. It's not the same than for other households. 5% decrease in their income is all the expenditure that they have for health for their families. According to ILO data, 60% of workers worldwide have already lower real incomes than before the pandemic. That's what we say. This comes on top of COVID-19 pandemic and on top of the climate change crisis. So the pandemic already left 60% of workers worldwide with lower real incomes. Now, a second part of the report analyzes the effects of the crisis at the regional levels, as you all have seen. With the United Nations Regional Economic Commissions, we have assessed the capacity of countries to cope, not only the exposure of countries, but their capacity to cope with the crisis. And we analyzed Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, South and East Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And we confirmed a widespread picture of vulnerability in all regions. And again, as we did in the first brief, around 1.6, 1.7 billion people are severely exposed and unable to cope with the crisis. Let's remember that 60% of the poorest countries are in debt distress or at high risk of it. So allow me now to turn to the recommendations of the brief. Firstly, on food. We must stabilize global markets, reduce volatility, and tackle the uncertainty of commodity prices. We remain convinced, like the Secretary General of the UN said, that there can be no effective solution to the global food crisis without reintegrating Ukraine's food production, as well as the food and fertilizer produced by Russia, into world markets despite the war. Restoring fertilizers availability, ensuring small farmers access, and monitoring supplies everywhere for the next 18 months will be critical. it is important to support FAO's proposals of a food import financing facility, a food import financing facility. While a humanitarian approach remains indispensable, it is not enough. We must not forget hundreds of millions of vulnerable people around the poverty line and wider groups crushed by the crisis. Informal workers, women, smallholder farmers, families on the poverty line. So we need to have a preventive approach. Governments must put in place social protection safety nets to offer targeted support to these groups and strengthen their ability to cope. But again, there is no solution to the cost of living crisis without a solution to the finance crisis. Developing countries urgently need financial support from international financial institutions so they can help their poor and vulnerable populations through social protection and safety nets schemes. Unless there is a strong effort from international financial institutions to increase countries' financial resources and fiscal space, countries will continue to struggle to pay their food and energy import bills, service their debt, and increase spending in social protection. All at the same time. International financial institutions must reactivate all their rapid disbursement mechanisms. Multilateral development banks must be capitalized and apply more flexible lending ratios. And we need a new emission of special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund, as well as more pledges to recycle the already issued special drawing rights from countries with strong foreign reserve positions toward the resilient and sustainability trust in the IMF. The funds exist and they must be made available. With respect to the debt architecture, you know that the risk of a major debt crisis with a possible domino effect is greater today than during the COVID-19 pandemic. The G20s must reinstate the debt service suspension initiative, and debt maturities should be pushed back by 2 to 5 years. The common framework for debt treatment created by the G20 must be improved to really deliver solutions for debt-distressed countries. For the moment, no country has been able to receive support so far. All continue to have to service their debt with no relief in sight. And thirdly, on energy, the use of strategic stockpiles and additional reserves could help to ease the energy crisis in the short term. But we must continue to push for transformational change, accelerating the deployment of renewable energy. Today, the world faces a crisis of access. There is enough of everything, but at the wrong price, in the wrong place, and at the wrong time. Tomorrow, the world may face a crisis of availability, where there may be not enough essential supplies, no matter where, when, and at what price. That is why we continue to insist that the problems of access, price, and timing must be tackled at the same time. We are in a race against time. This is why we are calling for action, action, and action. Dealing with the consequences of inaction, let me assure you, will be much more costly for all than acting now. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Just to note that we do have interpreters from Spanish into English and French into English if needed. Edie Lederer, Associated Press.
Thank you very much, Ms. Grynspan, for doing this briefing on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I'm sure you know that there was a meeting in Ankara today between the foreign ministers of Russia and Turkey, and that they voiced support for the creation of a safe maritime corridor in the Black Sea so Ukraine can export its grain to global markets. To address just what you've been talking about, the global food crisis. Russia is also demanding that the Black Sea be demined. And Turkey has said that allowing the Ukraine export should be accompanied by the easing of Western sanctions against Russia. You've been involved in this. What is your reaction to this important meeting?
Please.
As the Secretary General has said, Ukraine's food production and the food and fertilizer produced by Russia must be brought back into world markets, despite the war. This deal is essential for hundreds of millions of people in developing countries. At this point, I cannot say anything more than that.
Can I then ask something about the report? What kind of response are you getting from international financial institutions and from member states to this demand for action?
Yeah, very important. You know, Kristalina Georgieva and David Malpass from the IMF and the World Bank have also pushed for action to give more flexibility to the common debt framework so it can better serve countries, to avoid the domino effect of developing countries defaulting on their debt. And I agree with them. The G20 needs to step in and make the debt mechanisms more fit for purpose. But we will need the boards of the IMF and the World Bank to act and to introduce the flexibility needed in the instruments that they already have. The money is in the institutions, is in the global financial system. They need to make it available, and for that, any possibility of dialogue with the member states at the board of the IMF and the World Bank is essential, because they are the ones that have to take the decisions.
Just a quick follow-up. When are those boards going to be meeting, and is it soon enough to actually do anything quickly?
Yeah, the G7 is meeting at the end of this month, so a signal there will be very important, yes. And the boards of the IMF and the World Bank meets regularly, so.
Beytul, Anadolu News.
Thank you very much. Beytul Yörük, Turkish news agency Anadolu. I'll follow up on Edie's question. Following this meeting in Turkey between the Turkish and the Russian foreign minister, and given the efforts, what was said and what was discussed in Turkey, are you expecting any deal to be reached anytime soon? How close do you think the sides are to have an agreement on the grain export? And also, the Russian foreign minister said that his country was not responsible for the global food crisis. What is your reaction to that? Who's to blame for the global food crisis? Thank you.
Yes, I have to say that the only thing I can say is that discussions have been constructive, but there is nothing further I can comment at this time. I am sure you can all understand.
Just a quick follow-up on my second question. Who's to blame for the global food crisis? Russia is not taking any responsibility for that.
The most important thing is to stop the war, yes? But having said that, it is also true that there are 109, if I remember correctly from the report, restrictions on exports that have been enacted by 63 countries, making the situation worse. Yes. So a call for those restrictions to be dealt with, for no more restrictions to come to the market, is an important call that you all can help us give, a message that we can all give. Yes. So I don't have to comment on the more political part, but from a technical point of view, the important thing will be, as the Secretary General said, to stop the war. Yes.
Edward, China Central Television.
Hi, Ms. Grynspan. This is Dezhi Xu with China Central Television. I only have one question. Since you mentioned there's triple crisis, food, fuel, and finance, my question is on fuel. You just mentioned in short term, you urged countries to release their strategic stockpile, but the problem is last year, as we can remember, the major powers has already done that. Do you expect they still have this strategic stockpile to release? And secondly, since we're talking about energy price, and you also mentioned restrictions on the food by 63 countries. Do you have the same urge for those countries to also lift the restrictions also on energy? Because we know that Russia is a big export nation on energy. Thank you.
Yes, there are still stockpiles that could be released, and the OPEC decided to increase their production. Yes, that will also relieve some of the pressures on the market in the short term. But I emphasize the short term, yes? Because in the long term, what we need to do is really to go for a more transformative agenda for renewable energies, as has been agreed in the different conferences held in the framework of the UN, yes. One problem that has been affecting this is that the global value chains for renewables have been also disrupted. And there have been problems of access to inputs for the renewable energy projects. And that is something that we are looking into to see how we can release the pressures that also in that front are being felt today because of the disruption of the global value chains.
Thank you. Mario Vilar, FA.
I'll take advantage of the interpretation. Mario Villar con la agencia EFE. En el informe analizan la situación por regiones. Quería preguntarle por la situación en Latinoamérica, donde dicen que los mayores países no están demasiado expuestos a esta triple crisis, pero hay 19 naciones que están muy expuestas. ¿Qué regiones son las que están más peligro y cuáles son esos riesgos principales?
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Sí, en Latinoamérica y el Caribe, los países más afectados son los países centroamericanos y las Small Island Developing States. Y es muy interesante ver cómo estos países no están afectados solo por la parte de los alimentos, ¿no? Están muy afectados por la parte de energía y también por la parte financiera. O sea que en estos países tenemos the perfect storm, de alguna manera, ¿no? Porque son países que tienen poca capacidad dentro del mercado global para tener medidas de resiliencia con respecto a los precios, ¿no? Entonces, así como lo ven ustedes en el reporte, después de Sub-Saharan África, Latinoamérica y el Caribe, tiene el mayor número de países que tiene la exposición triple a food, energy and finance, ¿no? Y puede usted ver en el reporte también la difícil situación que pueden enfrentar en términos de la deuda.
Thank you. Pam Fox, CBS.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you for the briefing. I'd like to return to the discussion about the package that the Secretary General mentioned in terms of what you said. You were in Moscow, you had conversations about the possibility of opening a corridor, and you just mentioned the restrictions that could be lifted to help Russia if they allow this corridor to be open in one of many ways. The restrictions refer to the United States and the European Union say that there's no restrictions on fertilizer or grain, but Russia insists that it has all the other incidental sanctions. Is your sense that Moscow is looking for those incidental sanctions lifted, or all of the sanctions lifted in order to make this package work? And then I have one follow-up on the report itself. Thank you.
Yes, first I didn't refer to any specifics with respect to Russia in my former response. And, as I said before, there is a lot of things that the international community can do. The dialogue with the international community and our visits, together with the visits of Martin Griffith in Moscow, in Kiev, in Ankara, in Brussels, in Washington, have been constructive. That's the most I can say. It's true that there are no sanctions on food and fertilizers. But that's the word.
Waiting for the rest.
Yeah, let's
Waiting
move to
for the rest of that sentence.
Yeah.
No, but on the report, the 95 million, a lot of the report's conclusions, the 95 million people into extreme poverty may go into poverty, or their estimates and their projections. Does that mean that if the grain gets through, that those estimates are not the case? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Kristen Salome, Al Jazeera, and then we'll go.
I just more on the sanctions. Can you say what impact they are having on food prices? There are no direct sanctions on Russian fertilizer or food, but are there still issues with deliveries, insurers, and so on that had been raised earlier? The United States says they're happy to give those assurances. So are you seeing the sanctions have an impact, or is it Russia's holding back that has an impact?
The situation in the markets are very complex. And as you know, we did have already effects on the market because of the pandemic, yes? So to be able to separate all the effects that are producing the situation that we have is very difficult, yes? What we are sure is that the war in Ukraine is making it worse. That's what we are sure.
Thank you, Mrs. Grynspan. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. My question is about energy. Have you engaged with the GCC countries to convince them to increase their production? Did you talk to them individually or collectively, or you haven't even opened any channels with these countries? Thank you.
Not to my knowledge.
And why is that, if I may ask? I mean, the Russian foreign minister had just visited the region, and the president of the US is going there. It's all about energy, and you know how crucial the energy crisis in the world. So
We don't have a mandate to do that.
Gregory? Okay, good. Philippe Rater, AFP, and then we'll go to Paul.
Thank you. En fait, vous avez un peu répondu à la question de ma collègue parce que c'était pas très clair pour moi. Sorry. Sorry. In fact, you answer a little bit of the question because it was not clear for me when you say discussion have been constructive. If it was your discussion in Kiev, Moscow, and elsewhere, or the discussion between Turkey and Russia today. By the way, is UN was present at the discussion today between Turkey and Russia?
I cannot comment on the last because I was not there and the UN was not there.
So there was nobody from UN at this discussion.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, thank you.
Paolo Mastrolilli with the Italian on the issue of
If you could take off your mask while asking the question, thank you.
yes on the issue of grain again. Could you tell us what are your plans now? Are you planning to go back to Moscow, to Kiev, to have conversation? And do you see the possibility of a meeting between the four, UN, Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine?
Again, I cannot comment on that.
On your schedule, just on your plan.
Do you have access to my schedule?
No, I'm asking you if you can tell us. What is your plan?
We're announcing things as they come. Linda, NPR, please.
Thank you. I have a question. You said that no part of the world can escape.
Your microphone.
I'm sorry. You said that no one in the world can escape the food insecurity, financial problems, et cetera. And of course, the developing countries are suffering in the worst way. That being said, it's also the developed countries that are being asked to contribute financing, et cetera, through international organizations for the poorer countries. So my question is, how significant do you think is the suffering of developed countries? We know, for example, in the U.S., inflation is the highest it's been in 40 years. Prices are very high. People are having real problems here. So how do you think all of that, the developed countries' problems, will impact what they give and impact developing countries?
Yeah, it's a very good question, really, because the vulnerable and poor families are affected everywhere, not only in the developing countries, yes. But that's why we introduce also the variable of the ability to cope, yes. The developed countries have much more instruments and financial possibilities to help their poor families and their vulnerable families to go through this. But the developing countries have exhausted, really, all the space, all the fiscal space they already had with the climate change, with the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes. So that's why we are calling on the international community. We call for the solidarity part of the world, not to shrink, not to decrease, ODA is a worry that we have, especially in terms of the humanitarian support, yes, because the humanitarian needs are going up. But also what we are saying is that to prevent a larger crisis affecting more millions of people, the money is already in the institutions. It's already in the IMF. It's already in the World Bank. For that purpose, you don't need more fiscal space, more fiscal effort from the developed countries. You need those instruments and those institutions to really respond to the crisis. So for humanitarian, for ODA, we need a fiscal effort. But for prevention, we have the instruments and we have the institutions that can make the difference with the money that they already have And that's the call for action that we are really emphasizing in our report.
Thank you. We'll just take one last question. Stefano?
Thank you, Madam Stefano Vaccaro, La Voce di New York. It's a follow-up of the question that at the beginning were asked. It's about responsibility. Who is responsible for this crisis? You're talking about 1.7 billion people in danger or starving and else. Do you think that the fact that you didn't answer to those questions, the fact that you say, it looks like you looking at the practical aspect and say, we have to act. But the General Assembly, we have a resolution from the General Assembly giving responsibility for the crisis to Russia. So my question is, you don't want to give this answer and saying that there is a country that is responsible for all what's happening because you think it's not going to help to resolve the immediate crisis, and you think this is going to help, and so the UN should stop to give responsibility or looking for responsible? This is what you're telling us, that the crisis is so imminent that we have to forget who is responsible at the moment?
I am not saying anything in that sense. What I'm saying is that the mandate of the Global Crisis Response Group is to look at the impact of what is happening on the developing countries. That's the emphasis that we are giving in this brief, yes? And I think that it's important to look at that because these 1.67 billion people can really be in a very difficult situation. And that's why the Secretary General has made these efforts, not only to put together the Global Crisis Response Group to raise awareness and to propose policy recommendations for this not to happen, but he has been very clear and have asked Martin Griffith and myself to coordinate these two task forces to help find a package deal that allows for the safe and secure export of Ukrainian produce, food through the Black Sea, and unimpeded access to global markets for Russian food and fertilizers. That is the mandate we are responding to. So I hope my answer is clear to all of you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you.